Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Rip the Band-Aid Off, Addressing Tech Debt and Making the Case for Modern Built-for-Security IT Systems, Episode 6 in our CMMC Why Do We Do It webinar series. Today's presentation is brought to you jointly by NeoSystems and EPSD. I'm Don Carnevale, Marketing Director at NeoSystems, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can enter them into the Q&A area within Zoom. We will have some time at the end of the presentation to answer your questions. Also, we will make the webinar recording and presentation slides available to all registrants in the coming days. Now I'd like to introduce the host for today's discussion, Megan Kennett from NeoSystems. Megan?
Good afternoon. Hey, Don, thank you. And thanks to everyone who's joining us today. My name is Megan Kennett, and I'm honored to be the host of today's webinar. Today's webinar is the sixth in a series that explains the relationship between tech debt, vulnerabilities, and the safeguards in NIST 800-171, highlighting the reason that CMMC exists, and ultimately why organizations need to rip the Band-Aid off. Please tune in for future episodes of CMMC Why We Do It, a real look at real-world cyber threats and how using NIST 800-171 can help protect you and piece together the rest of the CMMC puzzle. Allow me to kick things off and make some introductions. So I'm Megan Kennett, Product Marketing Manager for CMMC Solutions at NeoSystems. Before joining NeoSystems, I spent several years advising commercial organizations on their cybersecurity practices and helping organizations in the DIB implement NIST 800-171 and prepare for audit. For those of you who aren't familiar with NeoSystems, at NeoSystems, we are experts who live and breathe compliance, reporting, and regulatory requirements, so our clients don't have to. We provide a range of IT and managed services, offering organizations an accelerated, affordable, low-risk path to CMMC compliance. And today, I'm pleased to be joined by two professional Band-Aid ripper offers and speakers. Our first guest is a decorated U.S. Army veteran and cybersecurity leader with nearly 30 years of military and corporate experience. He served in key cyber and intelligence roles across Army Cyber Command, U.S. Cyber Command, and the NSA, where he led blue and red team operations. After transitioning to the private sector, he held senior leadership roles at AWS, IronNet, and Symonics, and now serves as partner at EPSD and provides CISO services for organizations in the aerospace and crypto industries. He holds over 30 industry certifications and continues to shape the future of cybersecurity as head coach of the U.S. Women's Cyber Team. Please join me in welcoming Ken Jenkins, a strategist, mentor, and defender of critical infrastructure. Welcome, Ken.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks for having me today.
A little about EPSD. Ken's company. EPSD are strategic business technology advisors committed to driving meaningful transformation across complex enterprises. At the core of everything they do is one principle: impact. They don't just advise, they embed. EPSD reports directly to the CEO or the board, serving as the executive level force behind transformation initiatives. When engineering operations are broken, vulnerable, or distracted, EPSD steps in, not just to stabilize, but to reignite forward motion and set the stage for you for your next chapter of growth. So how do they do that? Through people, the strategic change management helps teams adapt, reduce toil, and focus on what matters so your talent can excel without burnout. Process, building smarter workflows and operational alignment that support your mission, automate the manual and drive scale. Technology, engineers that can't move fast without the right foundations. So EPSD finds the potholes in your infrastructure, your tooling, your governance, and helps fill them in so velocity isn't just possible, it's sustainable. And last but not least, the brainchild of the CMMC Why We Do It series, our third speaker, also an Army veteran, former CISO of NeoSystems, and thought leader who offers a very unique perspective derived from having over 25 years experience leading an effective managed services operation. who specializes in helping shape IT operations so that cybersecurity functions and compliance-oriented thinking are embraced and integrated as core parts of the IT mission. Ed is a tech and cyber evangelist driven to take security operations beyond the baseline by focusing on what makes our security defenses effective or ineffective. Welcome, Ed.
Thanks, Megan. Happy to be here.
So as in our previous CMMC Why We Do It episodes, today we're going to spend some time getting in the mind of the threat actor and exploring environments that are most favorable for a breach. We'll look at the real impact of tech debt and the cost. And we'll walk you through a couple of case studies that still hurt and that showcase those real life consequences of taking your organization down a tech debt end. Lastly, we'll explore the case for transformation and analyze some specific NIST 800-171 controls that can help corner tech debt and reduce your risk. So taking a step back and talking about the threat story. We seem to be doing a pretty good job making the attackers' jobs easy when we run outdated, broken systems and patchwork security. So Ed, can you walk us through this slide and how these stats specifically call out tech debt?
Sure. I think when people think about the threat and how they break into systems, there's always a lot of conversation about zero-day vulnerabilities, right? The hot new thing that just got announced. But the reality is that zero-day vulnerabilities are really expensive. They're really rare. Only the most sophisticated and well-funded attackers get to do that, right? That's the state-sponsored adversaries, those kind of people who might have access to a zero-day. The rest of the threat actors, and this is by far the majority, go after older vulnerabilities. And we see that in the statistic in the upper left, right? 40% were from vulnerabilities at least 4 years old, 10% from 2016 or earlier, so almost a decade old, still out there, still being patched. The reason is, these are well-known vulnerabilities. The tools and the techniques that are needed to exploit them are mature, they're readily available. So even unsophisticated criminal organizations can get access to them. They can buy them. They may already be familiar and having used them in other attacks over the past few years. So, and there's plenty of targets out there. There's plenty of unpatched systems that have these kind of problems, and plenty of insecure protocols still in use, plenty of weak designs. Attackers know how to find and exploit these. Like I say, we can see with these statistics, it's the majority. 70% of applications have vulnerabilities at least 5 years after production, right? So people are putting applications out there. You think over time they get more and more secure, they get patch, but that's not the case, right? What we find is that the software that we use every day has vulnerabilities, some of which are never found. So throughout its entire life, even if it's relatively old, it's going to have vulnerabilities that still are discovered, and you need to still be able to patch those. If not, the threat is coming after it.
Thank you, Ed. Those are great insights. So turning this over to you, Ken, what exactly do we mean when we say tech debt? And what are some examples that you've run into?
Yeah, for sure. I'll talk about examples a little bit later, but I want to get in and I want to really define what is tech debt, because the word's used a lot in different industries and different business units. So it's a hidden cost or the hidden effort that it compiles over time. And so I broke that down into 5 categories here to kind of digest it a little easier. But it stems from delaying upgrades, putting off implementing best practices or implementing prescriptive guidance. Honestly, what it does is it exponentially grows as either time goes on or lack of funding goes on or lack of awareness and keeping track with tech debt. So I categorize those in 5 different buckets, one being principle. So this is the effort that you use to address how you even got to tech debt. And it stems from shortcuts, it stems from negligence or not prioritizing, keeping up with latest guidance or patching operating systems and whatnot. So, and then there's interest. This is where complexity and effort is needed to keep changing with the times. So if you do major investments one year and then don't continue to do so, you have a hodgepodge of complexity and future changes that just keep compounding. And next is I talked about a little already, is accumulation. Over time, unaddressed and lack of effort, tech debt just gets worse, and it gets to the point where it can even start compounding. And as it relates to our talk today, with security, it just gets even worse and gets, it also cripples you to a point where you can't invest in innovation. Some examples of tech debt, again, we talk about it a lot, but what it actually is tech debt? It could be code, whether it's applications, whether it's scripts, whether it's things you use to automate how you do things in your business. It could be architectural refreshes, which routers, switches, firewalls, servers. Again, in documentation, sometimes policies and procedures are written at a point in time as it's relevant to a compliance framework, or maybe you have an audit coming up, but then those policies, procedures, plans are not reevaluated and updated. So those are a couple of buckets that I drop tech debt into. And then, what are the indicators that you have tech debt in your company? One of the biggest ones I've seen over the last few years is working with software companies is your DevOps process is very slow. You're not meeting sprints on time. You have continuous rework of bugs or vulnerabilities because maybe you didn't have a good QA/QC process. Also for agile systems, I see companies who build a phenomenal product, but only a handful of people can manage it because the system's so fragile, right? The end state of what they built is functional, but if something goes wrong, it's very difficult for them to keep up with it. Another thing is customer onboarding. If your product's so complex because you're carrying forward tech debt, it's difficult onboarding customers or different organizations in your business. So those are some of the buckets I use to define tech debt. One thing I like to note: there's many startups out there that intentionally operate with tech debt. Sometimes you just have to slow down in what you're doing, and you make decisions where you're going to prioritize another initiative. So it's a strategic choice sometimes to gain speed and agility. The problem is if you don't go back to this unmanaged burden, it just compounds over time.
Thank you, Ken. So then looking at the different approaches and mindsets and outcomes, when we're talking about bolt-on versus baked in, how can an organization avoid, heading down this path of the tech dead end? And why are there so many organizations that are doing this and deferring these upgrades?
So I think it's obviously different mindsets of acknowledgement of tech debt. So it's with security specifically is, hey, nothing's broke, everything's working as it should. We don't believe there's any threats or risk in our environment. So they're bolting on security as necessary, as opposed to taking a methodical approach that's derived from potentially a risk registry or a threat profile. So it's as needed. I'll do it. The bolt-on problem is, security feels fast until something goes wrong, right? When something goes wrong, then you go buy another product, another appliance, another security subscription. And then as time marches on, you start having these what we refer to here as unfixable gaps. You have a bunch of systems that aren't well put together, and next thing you know, the situation's just out of control. So, and the longer you do this, then you start running into where vendors don't they're not releasing patches, they're not releasing updates to maybe a license is ended, and you have end-of-life software or systems.
Well, the thing we see, Megan, when we look at people who are in the compliance mindset, right, where they're looking at the compliance requirements as a checklist, they tend to do the bolt-on approach, right? They say, okay, there's a list of 110 things and NIST 800-171. Let me count up how many I already have, how many I don't already have, and then I'm just going to take them one at a time. So rather than looking holistically at what these standards are trying, where the place where they're trying to take them, they look at solving them one at a time. And so that leads to this sort of bolt-on mindset. Well, I don't have this thing, so let me go get that thing and bolt it on to my existing system. And the problem we see time and time again with this is that it gets to a place, that dead end, as Ken just mentioned, right? It gets to a place where there's a few left and there's nothing to bolt them onto. The system might be fragile, as Ken mentioned on the previous slide, right? That if you start bolting stuff on to a fragile system, it breaks things. Or the system might have a poor design. It's just not amenable. So I go to bolt it on and there's no place to put it. So it doesn't work properly. And now I can't get all the way through compliance. So again, where we see people take this approach are people who are thinking about the compliance as a checklist rather than a holistic state of being and a mindset that they should adopt as a company.
Great points. Thanks, Ed. It seems like the majority of organizations are living in this total cost of ownership mirage and accumulating tech debt. What is, I guess, we kind of talked about how it happened, but, what is the impact here?
Yeah, so sometimes when you're making a decision with a budget or investing, it feels like you may be saving based on that decision, but ultimately you're deferring a decision or deferring funding or deferring an activity that needs to be done. Left unmanaged, that deferred maintenance turns into like what we mentioned earlier is tech debt. So interestingly enough, most of the tech that I evaluate, whether it's a services company, a product company, I find that there's no true budget, and we'll talk about that a little later on. Some of the strategies that CISOs use with spending, but I find that there's no budget for IT, cyber, or compliance, or they're piecemealed. So it's security gets bolted on as necessary as budget permits, especially in a DIB as we win a contract, as the contract funds. And it's always a balance to try to figure that out. So the other thing is, hey, it's working just fine. Our endpoint detection is working, our firewalls are working. So since we haven't discovered an issue, we believe it's still secure. Now, I don't think anyone just proactively says that to themselves. I think it's just a sentiment across an organization. And then, through this all, there's sprawl. So if you have a bunch of different business units working across a company, some may be a little methodical with how they request applications or hardware or even different solutions across the company. So if you're not careful and you don't have a larger strategy, you get what's called tech sprawl. Tech sprawl left unmanaged, it actually impacts tech debt even further. So we call it a silent killer, but it's just something that's compounding behind the scenes. As all that's being done, we've talked a little bit about threats. We'll touch a little more here shortly. This just opens up your attack surface and opens you up to existing threats. And in defense industrial base in general, you already targeted, the second your company goes into business, you're already targeted essentially because of who your customers are, right? And so what's the impact? Eventually, you're going to have downtime. You're not going to be able to bid on contracts, or when contracts renew, similarly with what we're seeing with different levels of CMMC, companies open themselves up to lose contracts. Ultimately, that can also result in brand damage or brand reputation impact. So the cost of doing this is of doing nothing is certainly outweighs the cost of modernization. Understand if you have to defer an investment each year, but it's a conversation you continuously have, so everyone's aware of it across the organization.
Double click on something that you said, Kat. You're talking about, if it's not broken, don't fix it, right? I think one of the big reasons we see that tech debt builds up over time is this perception that what's already in place is adequate, is working, perception that it's good enough. And they're looking, a lot of times companies are looking through the lens of day-to-day operations. Are my systems up? Are my users complaining? Are we meeting the objectives of management? And if not, we're good, right? And so things like weak security don't tend to be apparent when you look at them through that lens. We talked in a previous episode of this series about how long it takes on average to detect breaches, and the statistic was in the range of 6 months. So, and often the detection is not even by the victim, right? It could be external law enforcement or maybe even the perpetrators coming looking for a ransom. That is how you find out. So, only in hindsight, after an attack, after a system failure, after data loss, only then do those costs become apparent, because then you realize, oh, it wasn't working. We weren't in a good place. And so now you start to say, well, that's a false economy, right? I thought I was good, but I'm not, or wasn't. So it's important to look through that lens of adequacy in a little different way, right? Look with things other than just the immediate demands of your user base and your management.
Sure.
Really. Often we hear people talking about CMMC, being the cure, being the answer to security, whereas it's more of a compliance checkpoint. And I want to kind of dig into this concept with you all. And, if you look at CMMC as the cure, you are missing the mark. That modernization and those secure architecture design principles need to be put in place. That security program needs to be in place with that structure. Talk to me a little bit about what this means to you.
As CMMC has come out, right, I think there's been a lot of people that are excited, like, oh, this is going to solve some of these long-standing problems. And I think the DoD's touted it that way a little bit. A lot of companies are looking at CMMC compliance as a way to justify some long-deferred security spending, right? Finally, we're going to get some attention. And I would say that, this government mandate is certainly a motivator, but I would really caution against looking at compliance too narrowly, right? So in the DoD CMMC final rule, they put in a cost estimate for CMMC compliance. They estimated about $100,000. It's like 101,752 is the exact number. $100,000 for third-party CMMC level 2 assessment, but that estimate doesn't include any of the money that it takes to implement the security controls. Right. And the reason is because these controls have already required by previous regulations. So in the CMMC rule, they don't include any of those costs. It's only the new costs associated with self-assessment, or in the case of that 101,000, the third-party assessment. The DoD has stated over and over that their expectation is that all defense contractors have already implemented all these required controls, effectively that everyone has a perfect 110 score already reported on their assessment. So they know, and we know, that this is not true. Many companies have a lot of implementing left to do. So as you're thinking about budget and need, don't focus too much on that published number. Another caution I guess I would suggest is relying on the CMMC assessment itself as part of the solution. So CMMC as an initiative is a validation and enforcement exercise by the Department of Defense. It's intended to be a validation, not an education. So the assessors that you might hire under CMMC are strictly forbidden from giving their clients any guidance. They can only determine if the practices that they're assessing are sufficient or not sufficient. So it's not a tool for you to use to find out what's wrong with your security. It's exactly the opposite of the intent there. Fortunately, the marketplace we're in has a lot of good offerings to help companies get the structured approach that they need, gain the operational maturity that they need to achieve compliance. So there's consultants, managed service providers, cloud services, all of which can modernize your IT and your security approach, but fixing those root causes first, and not letting the compliance drive the train.
Thank you so much. Those are great points, Ed. We're gonna move forward and talking about the kill chain and a typical step-by-step sabotage, led by the bad actors playbook. Beginning with you, Ed. What enables these attackers to get started, and what are some early warning signs that SMB contractors can look for before their tech debt becomes an entry point?
So we've looked at this playbook in each of our previous episodes, and we've talked about how the threat actors systematically exploit systems. For companies that have a sizable tech debt, literally every step of this playbook is easier and more likely to succeed. So tech debt, and the reason for this is because tech debt tends to be pervasive. The sort of deficiencies that we're highlighting today stem from the lack of a structured approach to IT operations and security. So without this focus, it's highly unlikely for any aspect of the security posture to be strong, right? We in a pool of weakness, we don't see sort of pillars of strength, and so it's very likely that if there's a problem that facilitates a bad actor in steps 1 or 2, there's going to be a problem that's going to help them in step 4 and 5, I mean 6 and 7, right? So these when you have this this kind of weak strategy across the company, it makes the whole thing easier for the attacker. Years of penetration testing experience has shown that cyber attacks tend to proceed like falling dominoes, right? Once an initial weakness is found, chaining together other weaknesses into a successful kill chain is almost always straightforward when you're dealing with an adversary that's not well defended, right? So when the test or the attack, in the case of a real attack, is being carried out against somebody with these systemic weaknesses, you can see the dominoes fall one after the other, and that's the case for a real attack. It's a case in the testing scenario. That really reinforces, I think, the importance of coming at this in a systemic way.
Absolutely. Ken, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think that you know, Ed touched on it a good bit with once you gain access, the lateral movement inside, things start compounding. You know, the age-old adage, you know, in the red team or pen test space is, you know, a hard shell on the outside, really soft and gooey on the inside. Tech debt just compounds that ease of, you know, that ability for a threat actor, once they get in, to conduct lateral movement, you know, conduct a privilege escalation, hang out, be very stealthy. And again, not all threat actor actions have a true actions on objective. Sometimes it's they just hang out undetected until they need to conduct some actions on objective. So you know, with tech debt, you can be crippled here where you can't detect these advanced threats. So yeah, that's a good takeaway from this conversation.
Megan, you asked specifically about early warning signs that people could look for. It's perhaps a little out of context for this slide, but I want to respond to that question of early warning signs. If you're looking at your systems doing a vulnerability scan and you see vulnerabilities left over from previous years, meaning they go back more than a month or two, that's a pretty good warning sign that when an attacker gets to your system, they're going to find a field day there, right? If you can see those in your scan, they can find them, they can exploit them. Old vulnerabilities that you haven't fixed for whatever reason, I'm sure there's a great reason, is a warning sign that an attacker will find a very fertile environment for their attack.
Sure, that's a great point. All right, moving on. We've got some exciting case studies. I know this one specifically is often used as a wake-up call for organizations that are relying on legacy systems, and it underscores the importance of proactive investment in modern, resilient infrastructure and highlights the high cost of cybersecurity complacency. Ed, you want to bring this one home?
Sure, I'm going to keep. People have probably heard of this one. It's an oldie but a goodie, right? This is one of the classic attacks that happened where you had a lot of unintended consequences, right? So NotPetya was a Russian malware that was intended to go after some accounting software used in Ukraine and other places, and not in the current Russia-Ukraine war, but back prior to that. And shipping giant Maersk, they control a large percentage of the ocean shipping in the world. Global company moving essentially all the products that we import and export in our globe, was running this entire operation on a flat network. So when this malware executed, it was able to take down their entire system all at once. and they really lost all copies of their central directory, except for one system off in a isolated area off the grid by mistake. So they happened to have one copy left, and they were able to restore from that, but they were still down for a long period of time, again having this sort of spillover effect on global shipping for an extended period of time, weeks. They had a plan in place to fix that network. They knew it was a weakness. They knew it was tech debt. They had put it into their budget, but they had to put it into the bonuses for their executive team. So didn't get priority, didn't get executed. And at the time of the attack, they were still left with the sort of old, weak architecture. Again, they knew it had problems, but they didn't fix it in time. Had they segmented their network, had they done modern resilience techniques, the impact would have been isolated. This wasn't an attack on them personally. They weren't being targeted. It was just sort of an accidental impact. So very huge cautionary tale. Again, somewhat old at this point, but definitely cautionary tale for not letting old things pile up.
Good rundown. So let's cut through the noise. This next one wasn't some zero-day exploit or sophisticated adversary playbook. This was a service provider running outdated infrastructure that should have been retired years ago. Emails, DoD emails were exposed to the open internet, and not just for a few minutes, but for weeks. And the breach didn't just happen, it lingered undetected because modern detection capabilities weren't in place. So this is a great example about what happens when tech debt runs the operation. And just a good hard question for our speakers today, what would it take to stop something like this from happening again?
Oh gosh, this one is pretty overarching and reaching. One of the biggest things here was a little alarming that the Defense Department would have outdated server security. In this case, there was trust with a service provider, right? So they failed to protect the sensitive data. They didn't have the means to properly monitor this for the unauthorized access. There was no true anomaly detection capability. When you think about continuous monitoring of the environment. Also, there was a significant delay given the threats that were apparent here with implementing security controls despite the risks. These legacy systems were integrated with modern architecture without proper security reviews. So the impact, as you discussed a bit ago, Megan, is PI was exposed. The process for actually reaching out to the victims, not the breach itself, but to the victims of the breach, whose information was disclosed, took nearly a year. The government, this kind of gift that keeps giving when you have a breach is the government had to be forced to provide identity theft protection services, for victims' credits. Obviously, reputational damage to the DoD. I mean, when I think about who's securing my data, I generally look at, a government agency, specifically DoD, who I trust, having worked there. So reputational damage there. Loss of confidence. Who's managing our data, and obviously the long-term security concerns. Anytime there's a breach of PI or company proprietary information or messages in email, while the breach may get cleaned up, the long-term security concerns for that data floating around the internet or in a threat actor's hands, it just keeps compounding. I mean, if you lose your social security number, your social security number is not getting changed. It's useful when it's aggregated with other data, and it just keeps keeps bouncing around different threat actors and dark web leaks. So lots of lessons learned here. Tech debt just, doesn't just affect performance. It creates real vulnerabilities that can be leveraged. The other thing is, proactive security monitoring, even when you have vulnerabilities, could have really, the mean time detection, mean time response should have been much sooner in this case. The short-term savings of making some decisions definitely impacted longer-term costs. So again, in this case, regular security audits and upgrades need to be a part of the budget. They need to be owned by key leaders in the organization to protect stakeholders of these systems.
Thank you so much, Ken. All right, lastly, the 2024-25 top defense contractors, including Boeing and Lockheed, fell victim to another widespread malware due to legacy systems. Wanted to point this one out. Ken, how would you unpack what happened and how can we prevent this one going forward?
Yeah, so this one was interesting because it had to be discovered. It was discovered by Hudson Rock in a report. It affected major defense contractors, so it was pretty reaching. Specifically where Boeing is about 66 employees, Lockheed Martin 55, Honeywell almost 400, and then many organizations also were impacted. That we didn't really talk about today. And it was common malware tools. These were tools that you could buy on the dark web. You could buy by subscription, like malware as a service. It wasn't sophisticated attacks. It was just a manifestation of outdated endpoint security, inability to detect this malware, lack of network segmentation, employee security training and awareness. Just wasn't very clear to employees that this was happening. And then just with these legacy systems, again, I talk about the gift that keeps giving. Sometimes you cannot have modern threat detection capabilities with these legacy systems. So, again, delayed security patches and updates, just very similar to our previous use cases. So, what's interesting is some of this data, while it's worth a lot to individuals or to companies, you could buy it for as little as $10 per log, right? I mean, it was very easy for anyone to access and purchase. Also, VPN access, email systems, and classified procurement portals were exposed. Additionally, with supply chain vulnerabilities, all through this InfoStealer breach. So lessons learned here is, tech debt continues to compound as time goes on. What may seem like a simple vulnerability initial that maybe was deferred or deprioritized eventually has a greater exponential value to a threat actor. So in this case, also security modernization would have cost much less than the breach remediation long term. So seemingly minor security shortcuts turned into major consequences.
Thank you, Ken. All right, so we've been talking a lot about why we need to rip the Band-Aid off, but what exactly does that mean? What does a modern architecture look like, and what makes that up?
Yes, I'll jump in on this one. So one of the things I've seen that have made has had monumental impact to companies, specifically in the defense industrial base, is this thought of zero trust implementation. And this isn't a technology, this is a software, this is not a hardware appliance. It's a strategy that you're looking to implement across your company. And an easy, digestible way I like to talk about as zero trust is no device is trusted, no person is trusted until they prove who they are. So if you have, let's start with a scenario like a laptop. A laptop has to the OS has to be patched. The firewall has to be turned on. You have to have full disk encryption enabled. And so it goes through that test before it can connect to a system. And then the user of that system already had to authenticate to it, and then they have to re-authenticate to whatever application or service they're trying to access. So implementing an approach like this across a company really helps cut down on different forms of breaches and just that initial access that a threat actor can gain. So I'm really liking the direction that the Department of Defense is going in, and other large DIB companies, and implementing zero trust strategies. when I worked at AWS, we used to say the cloud is more secure on its worst day than an on-prem or legacy IT network. Now I know some people may laugh at that, and because if there is a vulnerability in the cloud or credentials are leaked, it can be very impactful. But it was built with security in mind, the ability to audit. So I really like a cloud-centric approach for companies versus investing on-prem solutions and trying to maintain things. Many of these small DIB companies don't have dedicated IT staff. They don't have dedicated cybersecurity or compliance folks. So, leveraging something like the shared responsibility model with a cloud service provider, especially with the requirements now to be in GCC high or in a controlled region within AWS or GCP in general, you have help there, whereas you may not have that help in if you're managing on your own, especially if you don't have a managed service provider. The other thing is MFA everywhere. I'm a big fan of MFA. While it's not the cure-all for everything, it does reduce the attack surface pretty dramatically. Yes, there's bypasses. Many red teamers will say, yeah, MFA we get in every time. But while that may be the case, there's still a high cost to the adversary, and it's a low cost to implement. So that cost to implement, cost of adversary is huge with MFA.
Nice.
And then, not too long ago, we were looking at using VPNs to connect my network, trust your network, my network, trust the network of my remote users and maybe their home network. It brings a lot of risk together. And, modern architectures, we're seeing people moving more towards virtual desktop environment, for example. And, with the virtual desktop, we can not have any trust at all in the endpoint that's accessing, right? So users might use their personal computer from home to access some fairly sensitive data. And we're not sharing that data with their machine. We're not inheriting all the risks that come with some machine that their teenager uses for gaming and that sort of thing. The other big shift we're seeing is a shift towards things that are professionally monitored and managed, right? So the idea that you could do your own security monitoring, set up some tools, have some alerts, versus having a professional managed security service provider with a 24/7 security operations center, do that monitoring. It's not practical to self-monitor your own system, and we're starting to see it's not practical in most cases to self-manage your own systems, right? As systems gain complexity by leveraging some of the things that Ken just talked about, cloud and MFA and zero trust, the management complexity goes up, and so having specialists that are managing that particular solution for you, so that you're buying it not just a generic tool, but you're buying it in a managed, compliant way. It allows you to consume it without having to become an expert on it. Is definitely a shift that we've seen. The last one I want to talk about is the reliance on user behavior, right? So we've always had a lot of worry about phishing and other kind of things that exploit user behavior, essentially social engineering techniques. Attackers are very big on these, and users, tend to make mistakes. Their security is not the number one thing on their mind when they're doing their day-to-day job. So although we still have some emphasis on training and educating users, we're starting to use a lot more technical controls so that we don't rely on the user to guess properly whether to open an email, whether to click on a link. We're using sandboxing and filtering and protection technologies that go a lot further. And I think as we see AI emerging, we're able to even further reduce the reliance on proper user behavior for the security of our system. So this is a big improvement.
It's a great rundown. Thank you. Looking at, when we talk about CMMC and why we're doing this and the lead cases for spending for security, Ken found an interesting statistic and study on what those leading causes of security related spending are. So Ken, how does this tie back to tech debt?
Yeah, for sure. So this is a very interesting study done by Hitch Partners. We at EPSD, we we really look at these categories and you know, just to kind of break out the slide a little. So you have privately held companies at the top, you have publicly traded companies at the bottom. So how's this relate to the defense industrial base? Wouldn't you like to be able to have a budget that's this dynamic based on evolving threats all the way down to incidents and breaches at potentially partners or vendors or suppliers? So I like to use this slide to really drive home the point. If you have tech debt, you're going to have a very difficult time being this dynamic with your budget, because you're going to have legacy systems. You're going to have potentially policies and procedures that haven't been reviewed or updated in a while. So I also find it interesting that, you know, publicly traded companies are really investing in evolving threat landscapes. So that means they're staying up with the times. What are threat actors doing? And really looking to shift based on whatever a threat actor is doing. So that tells me they're much more proactive with keeping control of tech debt. Now, many defense industrial base companies are privately held. I will say, just a takeaway from this slide, we did not break this out by DIB versus non-DIB, right? So there is a this is more the showcase that you want to be able to have these levers within your security spending budget or your security budget to make decisions like this. You want to be able to protect your IP, as you see in the privately held company. You're sitting at about 27%. And then when you look at the publicly traded company, they're not far off. So one's being a little more proactive early in the kill chain, one's being a little more proactive later in the kill chain. But you know, these statistics really drive home the point of, if you have tech debt, you're not going to be you're not going to be able to be as agile with how you're countering threats or working through the different categories that this graphic depicts.
No, this is nice. Thank you for sharing that. All right, shifting gears to the NIST requirements that relate to tech debt, and going ahead or sending this one over to you, Ed. How do the requirements address tech debt when we're looking at NIST 800-171 and these control families?
So the 800-171 has 4 control families that really relate very directly to the sort of issues we're talking about today. The standard doesn't come right out and say, hey, go get rid of your tech debt, but it does require a structured approach to managing your systems, and it does require vigilance in keeping those systems up to date and well defended. So I'm going to run through these 4 control families fairly quickly, because our goal here today is not to sort of teach you what the specific requirements are. You can go look them up, but rather to suggest a mindset around how to think about these things in a way other than just checking them off as a checklist, right? How to think about them holistically, and what are they trying to motivate us to do, and why is that a worthwhile thing for us to achieve. So let's go to the first one on risk assessment. So this control family we looked at before in an earlier episode of this webinar series, but it's relevant here as well. People tend to think about risk assessment as the big picture annual activity, right? But there's a lot more to that. And I invite you to go back and listen to the sort of previous episodes to kind of get some of that context. This control family also requires vulnerability scanning and remediation. We've talked a lot today about unpatched systems and how those represent kind of a gold mine potentially for an attacker. The requirements seem simple, but it turns out to be pretty challenging in practice to eliminate all the known vulnerabilities from our system. The tools to do the scanning are readily available, relatively inexpensive, so it's easy to go buy them and put them in place and start scanning your systems. But it turns out you need both specialized expertise and some good configuration and management practices if you're going to enable timely remediation. So there's more to it than just buy a tool, use the tool. And I would suggest too, as you're thinking about how you're periodically assessing risk, that annual risk assessment, it can be a wake-up call. It can help structure, solidify management support, but there's more to it than that, right? There's about letting that inform all the decisions you're making throughout the year, so that it's more than just a report, sitting on a shelf.
That's a great point, Ed. Yeah, the risk assessment can become a forcing function for you to clean your house, which is something that should be done on a very regular basis. So thank you.
preferably kept clean.
That's right.
I guess that's the message there. The configuration management control family gets right to the heart of the sort of unstructured ad hoc approach that underlies a lot of tech debt, right? So many small businesses don't need the level of rigor that's required here for operational reasons. The systems they buy today are pretty good at discovering and communicating with each other without a lot of careful configuration. You can sort of plug stuff in and do some work. But this ease of use runs very contrary to good security. So in order to effectively manage and secure their systems the way that's talked about here, with least functionality and restricting non-essential functions and controlling software use, right? To do those things properly, companies need to manage change well. They need to understand exactly what they have, what state it's in. That's an inventory function, change management function. The controls listed here all involve making explicit choices about configuration, not relying on the defaults, not just doing whatever it is that makes it work, right, to get the functionality you need. This is a really major shift of mindset that is often very transformational for IT teams. So if you're in an environment where you're operating with some tech debt and you think about what is the biggest change you're going to have to make in thinking and in day-to-day operations, not what new technology you're going to buy, but how are you going to operate differently? Change management is the one for sure.
Yeah, a good way, a good conversation I was having with maybe Ken the other day was, if you know what good is, if you know what good looks like, and you have that baseline, then identifying what's not good or what's bad is that much easier.
So let's go to the next one there. System and communication protection. So the last two were operational primarily. The next two are mostly more technical. This one includes these sort of design related items, such as establishing boundary protection, designing in security through the life cycle, network segmentation, deny by default encryption, right? So all when designed in from the start, these design principles can be fairly easy to implement, and they provide very good results in terms of both functionality and security. But it's challenging, often impossible, to retrofit these design ideas back onto an existing architecture so that it complies with these requirements. These are things that happen during the design at build time. So for example, if you're going to place encryption in FIPS mode such that only FIPS validated cryptography is used, this is something that you can generally only select during initial installation of an appliance or a software. So a firewall, VPN device, a server, you have to do that at the time of initial install. Rebuilding all your production servers in place to turn on FIPS mode, seldom feasible. If the systems you purchased were not selected and configured with these requirements in mind, and you're missing even one critical feature, often you can't get there. You can't get all the way to compliance. So remember, as you're thinking about CMMC, it requires a perfect 110 score. All the controls have to be implemented. Yes, you get a 6-month grace period after your assessment to fix deficiencies, but every requirement must be fully implemented within that grace period, or you're not CMMC certified. Sounds pretty harsh, right? But the intent of the government is to avoid the sort of endless poems that are commonplace today. So as you think about meeting these sort of design-in requirements by doing a retrofit method, the chances of missing a couple and not being able to get there crop up. So it's important to go back, do that design in from the start so that you've designed it with all the controls in mind and they're all going to fit somewhere.
Yeah, and that often implies getting rid of legacy systems and starting over.
It does.
I would add that sometimes it's not legacy. Some of these, right, in Ed's case, he's talking about like what if you bought a firewall that wasn't on a on an approved list or has
Right.
FIPS validated encryption modules.
Right.
It could be a new purchase that becomes tech debt immediately.
Good point. You can't
It doesn't meet the
on
requirements. So, yep, that happens all the time.
Firewall that doesn't support it, right? Yeah. This last control family, I'll keep it short because I know we want to get a couple of audience questions in here. This is a number of requirements that directly go to our ability to detect and respond to attacks. The first one, correcting system flaws timely, directly combats the buildup of tech debt. So we know all software has flaws. We know patching and updating is the only way to eliminate them. And we know this will continue as long as we own the software. So set and forget strategies where we buy something, get it working, and let it sit there. Just those strategies are completely undone by these requirements, which require sort of active management, active response. The last one is particularly interesting to me. I love that 800-171 put it last. Identify unauthorized use. Sounds pretty simple. This says we must notice when the bad actors have gained access to our systems. I mentioned earlier, empirical averages are around 6 months, if detected at all. In order to shorten this time frame and demonstrate compliance, we got to have a system that's capable of such detection, and we have to have the operational maturity to notice and take action when that happens.
Awesome. Great points. All right. And yeah, in closing, if you've got lots of problems, that's certainly a recipe for a successful attack. And you can't compliance your way out of a breach, but you can modernize your way into resilience. So I think I just skipped the slide, guys. I apologize. So just in summary, the threat actors do prey on the weak. Legacy systems and mismanaged assets are their golden ticket to exploit technical weaknesses. You can't duct tape your way out of a bad architecture. Bolt-on security buries the problem even deeper, and adding security on top of a flawed architecture only makes that worse. So if you want to lower risk, you really need to look at a purpose-built, secure design, modern architecture, zero trust, proactive monitoring and management, and taking that real oversight approach, not just being reactive.
See, we've got a couple of really good audience questions. Maybe we can take those if we have just a minute or so left.
Yeah, and just in closing, cybersecurity is a structured approach and a maturity journey. It's not a checkbox, and to do it right requires purpose-driven design. And that doesn't come out of the box. That takes years. That takes years to develop. So I just want to thank everybody for their time today. As mentioned earlier in the episode, today's webinar is the 6th in a series that explains the relationship between tech debt, vulnerabilities, and the safeguards in NIST 800-171 for CMMC, highlighting the reason that CMMC exists and ultimately why organizations need to rip the Band-Aid off. Please tune in for our next episode of CMMC, Why We Do It, Hiding in the Shadows, a real look at cyber threats and using NIST 800-171 to help protect you and understand how threats exploit the unprepared.
All right, thank you, Megan. So we do have a few questions here as we wrap up. I know we're at the top of the hour, so we're going to try to run through these pretty quickly. First question, how does tech debt play into compliance versus staying up to date? And how do you balance vendors that end support for an older version to staying updated to versions that have not reached validation for FIPS or FedRAMP yet?
Ed, do you want to take that one?
So end of support, there are some options within CMMC specifically around systems that have reached end of support or systems that have lost their FIPS validation because a new version has come out, right? So there's some operational POEM language in the final rule that allows you to manage that. What it doesn't allow you to do is to sort of lug that stuff around forever, right? It's intended to be something that happens as a temporary deficiency. There are some things in there for enduring exceptions, but it doesn't apply to this sort of thing, right? It applies to cases where I literally cannot, for some very valid reason, they list a few in the rule, update my systems. So if your reason for having an older system is just that I haven't got around to replacing it yet, that's not gonna cut it, I'll say.
All right, another question. How much does all this cost for a small business? We've been talking about the argument for a modern, built for security IT systems. What should someone expect to pay for this type of system?
So this is a multi-pronged answer to a very complex question. So I would say first, based on what type of data you're storing, transmitting, processing, and the complexity of your business, the complexity of the contracts you have, the risk you're operating with, that it it can be pretty dynamic. So one thing, you're going to have the cost of modernizing your company to even get ready to be compliant with as you're doing gap assessments and whatnot. So you may have some modernization you need to do. You have the potentially hiring of personnel to manage this within the company, and then the cost of potentially having a third party come in and Sherpa you through the CMMC process. And then obviously you have the third party assessor org that will come in and do the audit as well. So it's very difficult to just throw a number out there. The one number we really had was 101,000 for the CMMC assessment itself. But the maturization process that you may have to go through could be more costly depending on how you've been addressing your IT, cyber, and compliance requirements prior to starting your CMMC journey. So I know that's not a good direct answer that one would want, but it's a complex topic to unpack for sure.
I think that rather than give a number, I'll give a percentage. I think that we see it being double or triple what it costs to do it poorly, right? So if you're doing IT sort of that minimal way of like buy some laptops, give them to people, give them just the unmanaged, just toss some IT out there and hope it all works. It tends to do it in a structured way, in the correct way, in the way that's going to be able to demonstrate compliance, in the way that's going to be resilient against the kind of threats we talked about today. It tends to be double or triple that number. I would also say that, yeah, that $100,000 is an unfortunate number to see in the government, and people focus on it. It doesn't include any of the costs of implementing the controls, doesn't cause any of the costs of managing your IT, doesn't include any of the costs of operating your security program, right? So that is just a cost for the CMMC assessment activity, assuming that you're already set and already going to pass that assessment. So you've done all the homework. So in context, is the amount you'd spend to get ready for that assessment more or less than that number? Definitely more, I would say. And that's a small business average. So some very, very small micro businesses can get by fairly cheaply with a small enclave. But for companies in that sort of average size that they've done that estimate on, I would think think about that number and think that's just the number to assess and check and validate.
Yeah, okay, one final question here as we wrap up. We really want to wrap this up quickly here. Are there ways to exempt legacy systems from the CMMC requirements?
I mentioned about the enduring exceptions. So that doesn't exempt you, right? Because you have a legacy system. So there's some language in there and you may be tempted to try to focus on that. It's intended for situations where you cannot meet it, not that you've chosen not to meet it. So legacy system is a choice, not a requirement. And the exception that they list in there for enduring exception is, I'm replicating a weapon system in the field, so my replication must match it exactly. Or I have a health system, a healthcare system that has certain parameters based on human life and safety, and therefore I can't change those. Those are grounds for these enduring exceptions. I have some old software because I like it better, because it saves me money, is not qualifying. So I think the short answer is no, there's no way to exempt from them. Could you isolate those systems? Could you put some protection wrappers around them? Yes, there's some strategies there. They're seldom worth it, I would say, in my experience.
If I could, Ed, you raised some good points there. That question didn't say this system is in scope for a particular contract, right? So one of the things you want to get correct when you're going through CMMC is your scope, right? Where's the boundary at? Is that system even in play? If oftentimes a company may not be able to get through CMMC, so they elect instead to build some type of an enclave, right? That pushes the that pushes the solution outside of the network. Maybe it sits in a cloud service provider that's built in something like GCC High or a control region in AWS. So it just says, hey, we're never going to be able to secure this, secure environment, because we don't just operate in defense industrial base either. So we have other requirements we have to meet, and we're just going to push that out to another environment. So there's a handful of strategies that can be taken to address a situation like that, other than just building a moat around the solution, the application or product.
Good point.
Yeah, government assets and certain technologies that where you just can't run, or you're having to run FIPS 140-2, unfortunately, but it's on an older older version. Those are a couple of those examples of enduring exceptions. But otherwise, it is important that you understand your scope, you narrow that, you shrink that down as much as you can, and have somebody to help you Sherpa through that process, because it is definitely not an easy. It is very complex. So fortunately, there's companies like NeoSystems that can help.
All right, so this concludes our webinar for today. I want to thank Megan, Ed, and Ken for some great information on tech debt and how to address that. As Megan mentioned, here on the screen you'll see just a little bit of information about what NeoSystems offers with regards to CMMC managed services. We'd be happy to speak with you more about that if you're interested, so please contact us. Again, so that'll conclude today's presentation. We wish you all a great day, and we look forward to seeing you on our next webinar. Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody.